Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. When you hear this, I should be in Japan, unless Qantas do their usual thing of delaying and cancelling flights. And that means the next podcast, which will be the last one for 2024, should be very interesting because I'll be at the launch of the 10th Megami frigate, which, as people know, is one of three contenders for C-3000, the other two coming from Germany's TKMS. Japan is taking this extremely seriously, and the latest news is that the government has formed what I understand to be a unique steering committee that will be co-chaired by the Vice Minister of Defence and also the President of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. A lot more to come on that. Today, though, I'll have a lot more to say about last week in the United States. But before we get to that, on Friday, the day after I returned, I saw that Collins-class submarine sustainment has been placed on the government's project of concern list. And for those not familiar with projects of concern, it's a mechanism used by the government on advice from the Department of Defence when progress on a particular project switches from the traffic light showing green to amber, a warning that something is going seriously wrong and that everyone involved needs to focus because we have a big emerging problem. Bureaucratically, it's quite interesting because, of course, ASC is owned, literally and legally, by the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. And I'll come back to ASC ownership on a future occasion because it's still a raw nerve for me. So, Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy is warning his colleague Katie Gallagher that she had better lift her game, or else. The or else part is never made that explicit in these things. And just note, the media release came out at lunchtime on Friday the 13th. This is what we journalists call taking out the trash. In other words, you do it at a time of day when you hope no one is going to notice. And in the dry language of the release, it says I'm quoting now, the Collins-class sustainment program has experienced challenges in recent years with submarines required to operate beyond their original design life. It is essential that increased sustainment requirements are met to ensure that Collins-class remains an effective and formidable capability until it is withdrawn from service. Yes, well, that's it. Now, they only have to operate beyond their design life because of the total planning incompetence of Navy combined with successive governments. So at the moment, we have this going on with Collins-class, and as we discussed in the last podcast, we have Dennis Richardson, former Secretary of the Department of Defence, reviewing the Australian Submarine Agency. Now, but hang on a moment. It was only 2 months ago that the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, lambasted the media for not reporting more positives about the Collins program, while at the same time he declined to take any questions about the Collins program and rushed off from the conference he was attending to go back to his office. And a shocking thought, but could it possibly be that the Chief of Navy doesn't really know what's going on with submarine programs? Which would be especially strange since Vice Admiral Hammond himself is an ex-submariner. But I'm struggling to find an alternate explanation. The only one that springs to mind is that both ASC and the ASA were performing exceptionally well up until September, but in the following 2 months the wheels have fallen off both endeavours. But that just doesn't seem very likely to me. Whether people like it or not, I expect submarine stuff, especially AUKUS Pillar 1, and its corrosive effect on the entire defence budget is also likely to dominate or at least play a very important role in podcasts during 2025. Now, getting back to last week in the United States, I had got to the point of saying that we went to Moorestown, mainly to look at Aegis, but there are some other business areas that are really, really important, and one of those produces missile launching systems. The best known of these is the Mark 41 VLS, There are 1,300 of these worldwide and including in the Royal Australian Navy. But there are other variants because the trend is for militaries, particularly the US, but Australia as well, is to use far more missiles coming into infanteries because they allow engagements at greater distances. Now, one of these newer products is called the Mark 70 containerized launch system, which was originally designed for flatbed trucks to dramatically increase the firepower of Army units. A Mark 41 has 6 VLS cells, the Mark 70 has 4. Now, basically, the Mark 70 is just a slightly smaller version in that sense of the Mark 41, but it is deployed horizontally, as I say, on the back of a truck, and then hydraulically raises itself to the vertical firing position. Now, there's no reason why this system can't be used from any flat surface, and indeed, in the last few days, we've seen a development that the United States Navy has decided that Mark 70 launches will now go on some littoral combat ships which had previously been condemned as having far too little firepower. With the Mark 70 containers, you could easily have 2 on the hangar deck of a single LCS, and they can carry all of the normal length missiles in the US infantry, SM-6, SM-2, Tomahawk, quad-packed ESSM. With the simple addition of Mark 70, these ships immediately become powerful strike or self-defense assets, or both, depending on the mix of missiles that you're carrying. Now, quiz time. Which other navy can you think of close to home that is equipped with all of these missiles? Think hard, because there's a second question, so you get a bonus if you get both of them right. Which navy can you also think of that has 6 ships with large rear decks that have been derided by the Navy that ordered them and which specified their configuration as being militarily useless? Think hard. Anyone? Class? Come on. Well, of course, it's once again the RAN that operates all of those missiles, and the class of ships are the 6 Arafura OPVs. Could Mark 70 launchers be added to them? Absolutely. 2 per ship. No problem. Let's do the maths. 8 big missiles per ship, 6 ships. Why? There you go. That's an additional 48 cells carrying Tomahawks for land strike and added to the fleet at a relatively small cost. You would almost certainly think that the Arafuras will need a better radar, and something like a Saab Sea Giraffe springs to mind, and they already have a version of the Saab 9LV combat management system that might need a few tweaks, but hey presto, you could quickly increase Navy's firepower, and importantly, you could do it soon and cheaply. Rather than wait until 2030 for new C-3000 frigates, we could be pressing this solution into service in the next couple of years. This idea is so good and so cost-effective, I expect it will be completely ignored by the RAN. Now, another part of the US visit, after Morristown, the next and for me, the final part of the visit, I had to leave a little bit ahead of the others because just of work pressure things. This was to visit Sikorsky in Stratford. It's owned by Lockheed Martin, and the particular focus, as you would expect, was to look at UH-60M helicopters. These, of course, are very important for Australia because when Defence Minister Richard Marles decided on December 28th last year that the grounded Taipan fleet would never fly again, a decision, as people know, that I profoundly, utterly disagree with. There was something of a crisis since Army had no utility helicopters. The government asked the US for a favour, help us out, pal, And as I understand it, some of our UH-60Ms, which are a newer generation of Black Hawk, they had previously been earmarked for the US Army, but instead have been diverted to Australia, and everyone is very grateful for that. We now have 12 of them, with another 9 due next year. That means there'll be a further 19 needed to reach the final total of 40. I'm not sure of the rest of the delivery schedule. The Black Hawk family has an amazing record, with the first flight of the series almost exactly 50 years ago in 1974. I've actually visited the Stratford factory. It's huge by Australian standards, just mind-bogglingly huge. I've been there a few times over the years, starting in 1986 when I was making a TV documentary as obviously a very young journalist. And on the first visit, I had the pleasure of meeting Sergei Sikorsky, the son of the founder of the company and acknowledged aviation genius Igor Sikorsky, who moved to the US from Ukraine. Now, looking at all of the Hawk variants, and some are in commercial use, a total of 3,700 have been built, an amazing number for a class of helicopter. And the associated statistics are fairly mind-blowing. 5 million flight hours, 3 million hours in combat. UH-60Ms have been in production since 2004, I think. And like all aircraft, received progressive upgrades, including improvements to engines to give them more power, for less fuel, digital cockpit displays, and all of that sort of stuff. The helicopters still use mechanical flight controls, which seems something of an anachronism, but no one seems to be complaining about that. And they are expected to be in service until 2070, and the company is evolving the helicopters to include capabilities such as uncrewed autonomous flight and manned-unmanned teaming missions. These latter ones have a number of interesting applications where the helicopters carry a pack of small drones in some form of launcher. The drones are potentially armed, or they could carry stuff for jamming, or they could be surveillance drones that can be launched from the helicopter for a variety of missions. We're talking something maybe, 2 meters long with wings that can be folded out and with endurance of an hour, typically. I mean, this is all still experimental and under development, so nothing is yet fixed in concrete. And these drones, they could be controlled by the pilots from the cockpit using their screens, potentially from an operator in the back, and as I say, with payloads to suit the mission. One thing we know for sure, the drones won't be returning to the helicopter after a mission. They will either go to a base somewhere, crash land, or destroy their targets. Every year, Black Hawks save lives in combat operations and also natural disasters. You'll see that on TV. Sikorsky calculated for the last full year when stats were available, that was 2023, Black Hawk saved 2,190 lives around the globe. Now, let's conclude with a few words about the situation in Australia, and I'm going to scrub some of the information from the nice Lockheed Martin people as a professional courtesy, because I don't want them getting into trouble for being open and truthful, unlike the Australian Army in many regards. What is apparent to me, and let me say this is my impression, not anything Lockheed Martin said, but my impression is that Australia is so desperate to make a success of Black Hawks that they are throwing considerable money at this and are doing whatever Sikorsky and the US Army recommend. Their own practices, procedures, preferences, all of that has been ditched. It's now an attitude of you just tell us exactly what it is we need to do to keep these things in the air. Because imagine the public reaction if after the Taipan fleet has been destroyed and spare parts sold off, imagine what the reaction would be if the Black Hawk fleet were for any reason grounded. You'd think the shame would be so great that some people might actually start to question the competence of the Australian operators. Well, that isn't going to happen because these Black Hawks are coming with such a large support package, they will almost certainly operate flawlessly for the next 2 years. Anecdotally, the Australian aircraft are achieving about 70% availability, which is about as good as it gets for any type of aircraft, fixed wing or helicopter, because of the need for scheduled maintenance. That 80% figure was occasionally achieved by the Taipan fleet, but not consistently, especially on bases operated by the Army. Those maintained by Airbus helicopters directly had a far better record. But in 2 years' time, who's going to care about the statistics? By then, the Taipans will be a very distant memory, and Army will have succeeded with the narrative Taipan bad, Black Hawk good. If Army had ever shown the same level of enthusiasm, commitment, and willingness to spend money on Taipan, the story might have been quite different. I've never disputed that Black Hawks are an excellent, reliable helicopter and are cheaper to operate than Taipan. My point is that Taipans have additional features. I'm not going to bore people with all of those again because I've listed them so many times. But I will mention just one because it's a little obsession of mine and something that is illustrative of what's going on, namely the issue of a weather radar. As I've explained before, Taipans have them built in, Black Hawks do not. Army say that the Australian Black Hawks will have weather radar. At times it sounded a little bit more than that. It sounded like they've implied that the Black Hawks have weather radar now. Well, they do not. They can be fitted with something called an RDR 7000 weather radar from Honeywell. The picture can be displayed on one of the pilot's existing screens. They can be reconfigured to do that, apparently. However, fitting them to Australia's Black Hawks is a matter of time and cost, and I have found no evidence that they are going to be fitted any time soon. So yes, just to conclude on that, Black Hawks, as I say, excellent, reliable helicopters. Sikorsky, a great aviation company known around the world, and with the sort of production numbers and the longevity of the Black Hawk helicopter fleet, it's no surprise that matters of spare parts and things like that are just so routine. There are so many of them available that Army, particularly with their existing structures, are going to have far less problems keeping Black Hawks flying than they experienced with Taipan. I think I've said enough on that topic. Okay, I'm coming towards the end of my time. A few more words about Syria. The situation is still extremely chaotic, but it does appear that a government is forming. The big question is whether it's going to be a progressive, outward-looking government or whether it's going to be a hard-line Islamic state. And it's just a little bit too early to tell. But it is affecting the Middle Eastern dynamic. Iran is a big loser. Russia must also be very nervous because they have a major naval base there and a major air force base. They're pulling their troops, they're pulling their equipment out, and we'll be watching with a great deal of interest over the next few months to see how that particular dynamic falls out. Okay, next time it will be a message when I get back from Japan, focused very heavily on the Megami frigates. Goodbye for now, thank you for listening, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.